Hi everybody, welcome back to another video in the AP European History section. In today's video, we're going to look at the classical age of ancient Greece. Welcome back to another SheepCorn Studios video. Make sure to hit like and also subscribe and hit the bell notification to get all the updates on our new videos. I'm going to jump up here to the upper corner of the screen and we're going to get started. Last time we looked at Greece, we looked at the origins of ancient Greek culture and we looked at how that came out of the Greek Dark Ages in around 750 BCE and how that age comes to an end and we start to move into what we call the classical age of Greece. And so by the time we get to the classical age, one of the things that's really super important to remember is life in the ancient Greek world revolves around the polis, and the polis is your individual city-state. It's the thing that gives you identity, it's the thing that gives you purpose, and it's the thing that really allows your culture to exist because it allows for increased production of grains, specialization of labor, and the flourishing of Hellenic culture. Now, because all polises were different from each other, we don't have a singularly unified national identity in terms of all the people identifying themselves as being Greek. The people themselves would have identified as being Athenians or Spartans or Argives from Argos, or Corinthians, or Thebans, or Thespians. We would not have had people who identified necessarily as Greeks. They would have identified according to their polis, according to their city-state. And that really is the essence of Hellenic culture. Hellenic culture is the culture of the polis, the culture of the city-state. And the fact that all of them are unified in that culture, where all of them draw their identity from their city-state, all of them worship very similar gods. They generally have relatively similar cultural traditions. However, they think of themselves as members of individual city-states rather than as a unified Greek culture. Now, one of the things that was really important when it comes to the end of the Dark Ages in Greece is the loss of power of most of the archaic kings of ancient Greek city-states, whereas before, those tribal kings would have been seen as the leader. When it comes to the classical age, that king-led military and political system is going to come to an abrupt change with the development of a new style of combat and a new style of warfare that's going to radically change the way that Greek city-states operate. And that new style of military conduct is called the hoplite phalanx. Hoplites, or hoplites in ancient Greek, are the individual warriors themselves. They carry with them a couple of things that are really important. Three things, really, that are really super important. First, they're going to carry a long stabbing spear. They're also going to carry a short stabbing sword. They're also going to carry a very large round shield, which will cover them from their knees to their neck. And these are going to be made out of wood covered in bronze to prevent arrows and enemy weapons from being able to puncture them. Now, the important part about the hoplites is they are armored units, but also they are required to practice. They are required to be a professionalized military unit, so they have to get together and actually practice this. What they're doing as hoplites is they're unifying together in what we call a phalanx formation. Now, phalanx is the ancient Greek word from which we get the word phalanges, which is, of course, your fingers and the bones in your hand. If you just walk up to somebody or something and just smack it with an open hand, you're going to break your fingers. The way to hit something is to squeeze your fingers, your phalanges, very tightly together and hit right straight through the thing that you're trying to attack. And the concept of squeezing together to generate a huge amount of force and to not allow yourselves to break is exactly what this phalanx is supposed to do. Each hoplite is going to stand right next to the guy next to him. And the important part about this is when I'm standing in a phalanx, I have to extend my left arm, which is my shield arm, way out to my left-hand side, because my shield arm is not designed to cover and protect me. It's designed to cover and protect the man standing to my left. So one of the things you have to understand about this phalanx is it depends on practice, it depends on trust, and it depends on unit tactics to be able to win a battle. But if you can do that, when all of these guys can march together and can maneuver together and can make sure that they're all covered so that essentially the enemy is always going to be expected to be held to the left-hand flank of your military formation so that there's no way for them to really get in here and attack your soldiers. The guys in the back who cannot extend their spears out in front of the phalanx itself, and you can see up here 3, maybe 4 of the front lines are going to be able to extend their spears out. So if enemy cavalry or enemy infantry come walking up to the front of the formation, there's really no way for them to get in here and to attack and to hurt these guys because they're carrying very long spears. Beyond the first 3 or 4 lines of this phalanx formation, we've got the rest of the formation who are holding their spears up at various angles. This is actually a really critically important feature of the phalanx, because if the enemy starts to launch arrows at you, those guys can swing those spears back and forth above them and knock a lot of the arrows out of the sky before they're able to impact and injure the remaining hoplites in the phalanx. It's a very, very, very innovative military strategy and tactic, and ultimately what it does is it allows the Greek city-states to become very, very powerful. The fact that this hoplite phalanx comes to be the standard style of Greek city-states fighting battles, though, does make a couple of big changes. The first big change is it's no longer entirely predicated on the king to defend the society and to protect people. Now we can see that as long as you can afford a spear and a sword and a shield, you can be responsible for the protection of your city-state, and that means that ultimately you have social importance. As a result of that, it's not just the king who's designed to protect anymore. Now it's this class, this knightly class is responsible for protecting society. And so as a result, society is expected to take care of them. And what we see from the development and formation of this hoplite phalanx is the relative democratization of the Greek city-states. The hoplite phalanx makes at least all of these particular people important. Now, it's also worth noting that, of course, there was still things like slavery in ancient Greece. Even in a city-state like Athens, they still held slaves. Those slaves, of course, were not as important to the society as the hoplite class, the citizen class, and that's the difference between a citizen and a person who just lives in your community. A citizen takes personal responsibility for the defense of the country. That's what the hoplites did, and that's why they have political power. This then solidifies the Greek identity of living in the polis, because you as a hoplite have an obligation to society, and society then has an obligation to take care of you as a defender of itself. And that identity really becomes a staple feature of what makes Greek city-states fundamentally different than any other culture at this particular period of time. The classical age really begins with the Persian Wars, because as these Greek city-states become more powerful and more important, and their influence and culture start to spread, eventually that spread leads them into a conflict with the very old, very large, and extremely powerful country next door, which was the Persian Empire. What we see is on the western coast of Asia Minor, and at the time they would have called it Ionia, several different city-states start to go into rebellion against the Persian Empire, and many of them are being supported by Greek city-states. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos. Those city-states are supporting the rebellions in Ionia. And as a result of that, the Persian king decides that the Greek city-states are a major headache for him, and he needs to do something about that. In the year 499, war comes to fruition between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states in general. This war is going to last for 50 years between the two political powers. This war really starts because in the year 547 BCE, Cyrus the Great, who was the emperor of the Persian Empire, conquered the Greek-speaking peoples of the western part of Asia Minor, of Ionia. And so there was always this kind of chip on the shoulder of the people living in Ionia. In 499, the Persians declared war, and ultimately it took them about 6 or 7 years before they were really able to start an actual invasion. And that invasion was going to happen in the year 492 BCE. The Persian general Mardonius traveled into Thrace and Macedonia and actually subjugated both of those regions. But then, of course, the big problem for him was dealing with the more powerful and prosperous city-states in Lower Greece. In the year 490, Mardonius sent a fleet to deal with the two leading powers at the time, the first of which is Athens over here, and the second of which is Sparta. Mardonius sent this fleet to deal with them in the year 490, and that fleet landed in a place called Marathon, which is right here just outside of the city of Athens. The Battle of Marathon took place in August or September of the year 490 BCE between the Persian army that was landing on the beaches of Marathon to force Athens to capitulate and to force Athens into either staying out of their political affairs or signing a treaty that would allow them to at least stop causing problems for Persia. The Persians specifically chose this time period to attack because of the fact that in Sparta they had a celebration called the Carneia, which prevented them from going into the field to fight. And so the Persians realized that by removing the Spartans from the battlefield, they were going to make it much more likely that they could conquer Athens first and then deal with Sparta afterwards. So at the Battle of Marathon, what we see is we don't really have a Spartan army. It's basically coming down to the Athenians, who are going to have to use their hoplite phalanx to defeat this much larger Persian army. The Battle of Marathon is really a classic example of military tactics and strategy. On this map, the blue is the Greek city-states, mostly the Athenians, and the red is the Persians. The Persians vastly outnumber the Athenians, and so what the Athenians do is the vanguard, which is the leading force, comes out in a very, very thin line, and the Persians look at this and say, well, there's not a whole heck of a lot of them. They're going to have to turn around and run. The Athenians then, once they march forward, see the size of the Persian army and turn right back around and start to retreat. This gives the Persians a sense that they're so dominant and so powerful that the Athenians are cowards and they're turning around and running away. Because they know that this great victory is about to happen for Persia, the entire Persian army breaks ranks and starts chasing after the Greek vanguard. What the Persians don't know is that a large bulk of the Athenian force has been split off onto either flank, and as that Persian army advances out beyond their line of support, the Greeks move in behind them and they do what is called an envelopment, which means they totally surround the Persian army, cut them off from any reinforcements that they've got, from any supplies that they've got, and they start to mercilessly pick this army apart, producing an enormously unexpected victory for the Athenians. Following the Battle of Marathon, we get another really popular and really famous thing that comes out of ancient Greece, which is to announce the great victory at Marathon. A man named Pheidippides runs the entire distance between Marathon Plain and the city of Athens to announce that the Athenians have protected themselves from the Persians. The distance between Marathon and Athens is 26.2 miles, which is why today we refer to the 26.2 mile foot race as a marathon. Now, the one thing that marathon runners need to remember is Pheidippides, the first guy to ever do this, When he got to Athens, he announced the victory over the Persians and then immediately had a heart attack and died. After the Persian failure to invade Greece in the year 490 under King Darius I, Darius died and left his oldest son to try to invade Greece. In 481, we see the second Persian invasion of Greece, and this comes from Darius I's son, whose name was Xerxes. Xerxes, rather than having half of the invasion come through Thrace and Macedonia and the other half come on the Aegean Sea, Xerxes decided he was going to send this enormous land army down through Thrace and Macedonia, through Thessaly, and into Lower Greece to subjugate the Greeks. In 481, Xerxes also timed this particular invasion to coincide with the Spartan Carneia so that they were not allowed to participate. However, Sparta had two kings, one of which was supposed to stay with the army, and one of which was supposed to stay behind and govern over the city. One of the two kings of Sparta, whose name was Leonidas, decided that he needed to slow down the Persian advance and to prevent the Persian army from getting into the lower part of Greece. He knew he wasn't going to win. All he wanted to do was to slow down the Persians so that the Carneia would end, the Spartan army would be able to leave Sparta to get into the field to fight, and ultimately they could save the Greek culture that the Persians were there to subjugate. Very famously, Leonidas took with him 300 Spartan warriors. Now, the thing that everybody likes to forget is, in addition to the 300 Spartans, there were 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans that all went out to meet this Persian army in a place called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. This is on a very narrow pass through the mountains because Greece is enormously mountainous. It's very difficult to get around, and there's a pass right over here that's incredibly narrow. And Leonidas said, because I only have a few guys with me, I've got to use the terrain to my advantage. So if we can cut off the Persians here at Thermopylae, we can slow them down enough that the Carneia will end back home in Sparta. The rest of the army will be able to meet us later, and we'll be able to keep the Persians right the heck out of Greece. When Leonidas got to Thermopylae, one of the things he found was an old defensive fortification called the Phocian Wall, which he and his men rebuilt. At the time that this occurred in 480 BCE, the water would have been right up here about where the highway is today. The Persians would have been moving south from this far distance over here, and the Spartans and their allies would have been set up on this side. And you can see this is a very narrow pass to try to move a large army like the Persians have through that particular area. And so that's a huge army moving through a very, very narrow gap. That's why the Spartans have this enormous advantage. Not only because they're super powerful and incredible warriors, but they're also using the terrain and the strategy against their enemies. Now, when Leonidas meets Xerxes at Thermopylae, the historical sources themselves actually give us a lot of the classic lines from the 300 movie and graphic novel. Xerxes tells him to surrender, and King Leonidas says, if you want our arms, molon labe, come and take them. If you're going to take my weapons, you come and get them from me and see what happens when you get over here. Like, that's how Leonidas works. That's how Spartans work. Xerxes warns him. He says, I have so many archers here that our arrows will block out the sun. To which King Leonidas, very famously in the historical sources, replies, then we will fight in the shade. This is the very essence of the Spartan mindset of never back down, never surrender, never give an inch, and do whatever is necessary to win. Like, this is what their culture and civilization is based on. Ultimately, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans are killed by the Persians, but Leonidas was successful in slowing down the Persian advance to the point where the Spartan army was able to come out of Sparta because the Carneia was over. They linked up with lots of other city-states armies and ultimately would defeat Xerxes at the Battle of Plataea in 479, which was also coupled with an Athenian victory at the naval battle of Salamis in 480. These two battles broke the Persian army and navy and protected Greece and allowed the Greek city-states to maintain their independence so that eventually they could go on to produce what we now today refer to as Western culture, based on this idea of individualism, citizenship, responsibility to your city-state. That's really what was at stake here at Thermopylae. So I hope that this video on the transition from the Dark Ages of Greece to the Classical Age of Greece and the Persian Wars was good for you. If it was, leave a like, hit subscribe, hit the bell notification so that you get updates when all of our new videos post, and I will see you in the next one.